So the scriptures are first from the book of Lamentations. We don't read that often from the Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible. Chapter 3, verses 19 through 24. It says, I'll never forget the trouble, the utter lostness, the taste of ashes, the poison I've swallowed. I remember it all, how well I remember the feeling of hitting the bottom. But there's one thing I remember, and remembering I keep a grip on hope. God's steadfast love never ceases. God's mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. God is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in God. Romans 8, verse 25 and verse 28. If we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. And we know that all things work together for good, for those who love God, who are called according to God's purpose. And finally, from the Gospel of John, chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus said, I have said these things to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world, you will face tribulation. But take good courage. I have overcome the world. Well, I looked around for Advent hope jokes and couldn't find anything that combined the two, So Advent, here's the best one I could find. It says, I really don't see much of a future for Advent candles, or Advent calendars, rather. It seems that their days are numbered. And as far as hope, this one was pretty pathetic, but kind of, you'll see. He said, I texted my girlfriend, invited her to go to the gym with me, and then I didn't show up. I hope she gets the message that we're not working out. They just seem to keep getting worse, don't they? Sorry about that. It's hard to believe that the season of Advent is here once again, actually. It kind of sneaks up on you, doesn't it? All of a sudden it's Thanksgiving, and then we have the so-called Black Friday phenomenon, and then a downright overwhelming degree of football, and then it's Advent Sunday. I'm really glad it's here this year. And in fact, one of the treats of becoming your pastor, maybe some of you don't realize, prior to coming here 3 years ago, in fact, today is my 3-year anniversary with you all. Yeah. It's gone fast, hasn't it? At least it has for me. Prior to my coming here, though, I didn't really get to experience Advent with the community. Because I was always zipping in and out of different churches. I had a freelance musical ministry for over 30 years, and I was in different churches all the time. And it's really been wonderful for me to just experience Advent. And these 4 themes of hope, peace, joy, and love as we get ready for Christmas. Today, I'm glad it's the theme of hope, because I think a lot of us could use a word of hope about now. As I mentioned before, there's this new variant of the coronavirus, the Omicron variant. We don't really know what we're about to look at, but it's concerning those who do know. That's about all we know right now. And as was mentioned in our prayer time, the horror of what happened in Waukesha, the complex reality of the Kyle Rittenhouse trial and that verdict, thank God, some justice for Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. And I just happen to know that a lot of you are going through some stuff personally that's not easy at all. So, it just feels like one of those times when, a word of hope would be nice. And as I was reflecting on that this week, I was reminded once again that Advent hope is way deeper than just some nice words. And in fact, I was reminded of how dangerous and ultimately cruel false hope is. I've learned that over the years in my work in Haiti. It was a difficult lesson to realize that it was a more loving thing to look in the eyes of a person who brings a malnourished, sick, and dying child to me, saying, "Can you help us?" And me to say, "You know what? I see you. My heart goes out to you. But I and the organization I work with are maxed out, and we can't help you." It's just the way it is sometimes. And it was more loving, though, to tell the truth than to say something like, "Well, I'll see what I can do and I'll get back to you," which would have felt better to me. And I only know that because I did it a few times. And then showed up months later and the child was dead. And they said, you promised. It was cruel. And not long ago, when this first wave of the coronavirus hit us, to have political leaders, I won't name any names, but to have people say, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. In fact, it's a hoax." That was cruel. It was not truthful. It was trying to give false hope, or worse, trying to manipulate by saying things that sounded better than the truth would have us understand. So I'm not going to give you any false hope this morning. I don't believe in it. Hope isn't just wishing for the best. It's not about a denial of painful or frightening realities. It's not optimism or positive thinking. It's about the courage that we need to deal with what's really going on in ourselves, relationships, life. In recovery circles, they talk about being free to deal with life on life's terms. Because that's when we get to experience the blessings and the healing presence that only comes as we deal with the difficulty. John 16:33, that text that we just read, it's another one of those verses that is worth memorizing. I memorized it long ago with the help of a song. Once we can sing together, I'll teach you this song. But it's, "These things have I spoken to you, that in me, Jesus, you might have peace. In the world you'll have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." In the world. That means right here where you and I live, our real lives, every day, the nit and gritty, is that the term? The nit and grit of what you really go through. What you're dealing with right now if you're in the midst of something difficult. Jesus says, you'll have tribulations here. The Greek word tribulation, translated that, means distress, hard circumstances, and suffering. And Jesus is telling us that in the world, we're going to have some hard circumstances sometimes. We're going to go through some stuff. And that's real. And it will be true whether you follow Jesus or are spiritually committed or not. But Jesus says then, but be of good cheer. The Greek word there means literally take courage. Let your heart be brave. Because I, Jesus, have overcome. The Greek word there means I have prevailed. I've seen it through. It even means I've won the verdict, as in a court case. So he says, I'm going to show you how to wholeheartedly and even joyfully be at peace as you face hard times, knowing that God is with you and that when all is said and done, love will prevail. God's love and truth will be the verdict in the end, and our invitation now is to be witnesses called by God to testify in the case of humanity here on earth. Now, for the rest of my message today, I'm going to actually share excerpts and quotes from three of my favorite authors and speakers. The three are Nadia Bolz-Weber, Rachel Held Evans, and Valerie Kaur. Nadia Bolz-Weber, in case you don't know her, she's a Lutheran pastor, author, recovering drug addict, and former stand-up comedian who has the entire church calendar year tattooed on her arms, across her chest and other arms. Quite a character. She says, Advent hope is absurd. It's the hope that only comes to us when we know we pretty much got nothing to offer. And definitely nothing in the face of what we're up against. It's really about what God does, or even more fragile than that, it's about believing in what God can do with nothing. It's about what God does for us, in us, and through us when we're pretty darn sure we don't have what it takes and we're about to be exposed for the hopeless mess we are, and that it's all about to hit the fan. And she says it's almost as if part of the whole thing is that God evidently loves to use the most vulnerable, unimpressive, unlikely people to work through. I mean, of all the ways that God could have given us the Messiah, God chooses to get a young teenage unwed Palestinian girl pregnant, which was a scandal to her family and dangerous for her. And then God leads her to give birth in a barn among animals, and she and the baby are then immediately targeted to be killed by a narcissistic political leader. So she and poor Joseph and the baby then become refugees running for their lives, seeking asylum. No wonder this kid grows up to say, hey, in this world, you're going to have some hard times, and it's going to hurt, and you're going to have to deal with the fear, and it's going to drive you to the end of yourself. And sometimes it's not going to be clear what you're supposed to do or how you're going to get through it. And Nadia says, so if you're worried that you don't have what it takes and that you can't do this, whatever life is throwing at you, you can't pull it off, then the good news is you're right. You don't have what it takes. You on your own don't have what it takes. But you do have the God that it takes. In fact, sometimes it's going to seem like God is all you have. And you're going to be tempted to say to yourself, God's all I have? No offense, God. But so much of the time, it doesn't feel like it's enough. So Advent hope is being reminded right at that point, when you know you're not enough, that God somehow is. And then being blown away when you realize that knowing that God's enough is enough. When you know that God is enough, then that's enough. And how are you going to know that? By experiencing that. Rachel Held Evans was an amazing vessel of Advent hope for so many people. She grew up in a very conservative Christian context in the South, and she was a blogger and a speaker and an author of several books in which she shared her own spiritual journey from a legalistic hellfire and brimstone judgmental form of Christianity into a more progressive and expansive understanding of the Bible and the way of Jesus. And what I'm about to share with you is an excerpt of hers from a sermon she gave while she was pregnant in her mid-30s. The sermon is called The Way of Jesus, and you can find it on YouTube. And she had no idea when she gave this sermon about how God seems to work more through our difficulties than through our so-called successes, that she was about to be diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. And that shortly after she would give birth to this baby she was pregnant with while preaching this sermon, she would die at age 36. She said, Jesus lets his disciples know that on his path, God will do some of the most significant work through our suffering. Not by having it all together or getting it right, but by being willing to go through difficulty and trust, not that God will take it away, but that God will actually use the suffering to do the sacred work of transformation. That's a different kind of hope. And then she quotes from what to most of you will be a very unfamiliar source, a Franciscan priest by the name of Richard Rohr. If you're new here, they're laughing because I quote him a lot. See how I got Richard in here through Rachel? I mean, that was, yeah. He says in his book, Falling Upward, the human ego prefers anything, just about anything, to failing or changing or dying. The ego is the part of you that loves the status quo even when it's not working. The ego hates losing, even to God. But one of the best kept secrets, and yet one hidden in plain sight, is that the way up is the way down. Or if you prefer it, the way down is the way up. There is necessary suffering which cannot be avoided, which Jesus calls losing our life. Normally, a job or a fortune or a reputation has to be lost. A death or an ending of some kind has to be suffered. A house flooded or a disease has to be endured to push us to spiritual maturity and loosen our grip on the need to control. In the divine economy of grace, suffering, sin, and failure become the raw material for the redemption purposes itself. And Rachel goes on to say, nobody is exempted from this. Jesus wasn't. There are things that we only get to know by moving through the difficulties and then watching how God turns them into blessings and lessons that make all the difference in the world. You know that's true from your own life. Most of us, the things you really know did not come easily. All right, last one, Valerie Kaur. Valerie Kaur is a Sikh woman, S-I-K-H, the Sikh religion. She wrote a book called See No Stranger that Martha Olson brought to us initially in our morning devotion group. And I have read it, and it's just a stunning book, very powerful. And I will end by sharing this excerpt from her. She says, my friend William Barber had invited me to speak at the Metropolitan AME Church, a historic black church in Washington, D.C. Like millions of Americans, I was still in shock over the results of our 2016 presidential election. I looked out at the crowded church and saw grief and anticipation in people's eyes. The future is dark, I said, but what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country that is waiting to be born? What if the story of America is one of long labor? What if all of our grandfathers and grandmothers are standing behind us now, those who survived occupation and genocide, slavery and Jim Crow, detentions and political assault? What if they are whispering in our ear, "You are brave"? What if this is our nation's greatest transition? As I said these words, the crowd erupted in cheers and shouts and cries of hallelujah. It was like a revival. Reverend Barber was on his feet, his great bare hands outstretched over me. "What does the midwife tell us to do?" I cried over the roar. "Breathe and then push." In the weeks that followed, that address was viewed about 40 million times around the world. And my words began to appear on protest signs. I received thousands of inquiries from people asking, how do we breathe? How do we push? How do we keep laboring for justice when we feel hopeless? I also became a target of online hate from the far right and got messages that I should be deported or killed, and my son also. I was a civil rights activist and lawyer who had labored with brown and black communities since 9/11. I was a Sikh American, a woman of color, for whom these struggles were deeply personal. Now I was also a new mother, and I was exhausted. I needed to answer these questions for myself as much as for others, and that's why I wrote this book. And one last excerpt. She said, "You know, some days feel so deadly. I can taste the ash in my mouth. Other days I see glimpses of the nation, the world that is wanting to be born. A society awakened to the truth of our interdependence. I choose to labor for that world. Sound government is necessary, but it's not sufficient to take us across the threshold. We need a shift in consciousness and culture." And that, brothers and sisters, is why I'm a Christian. Because it is about an awakening of consciousness that changes our lives and could change the world. Going back to her, she says, we need a revolution of the heart. A new way of being and seeing that leaves no one outside the circle of care. A love without limit. Revolutionary love. Revolutionary love is the call of our times. If you cringe when people say that love is the answer, I do too. I'm not talking about sentimentality or civility or just thoughts and prayers. I'm talking about love as labor, as conscious, embodied practice. Social reformers and spiritual teachers through history led entire nonviolent movements anchored in the ethic of love. Revolutionary love is the choice to labor for others, including our opponents, and for ourselves in order to transform the world around us. There's more, but I'll leave it there. Advent hope is what gives us reason to say, hey, could it be that what I'm facing right now personally is actually the darkness of a womb and not the tomb? Could it be that what I'm dealing with right now is about what's about to be born, not what I'm losing? And that's why I say to you, Mary's pregnant. Do it again. Mary's pregnant. Yes, I have. I'm looking at her. Amen.